I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. You know what we say here, folks, on the MeidasTouch Network? MAGA stands for Make Attorneys Get Attorneys, and Donald Trump's attorney, John Eastman, was just filed on by the California State Bar, which has officially filed notice of disciplinary charges following a significant investigation into John Eastman's false assertions to courts, his frivolous filings, his attempt to overthrow our democracy, his filing of perjurious declarations, and so much more. The State Bar announced it, California announced it on their website earlier on Thursday, and this is what they said in their announcement. It says, the State Bar of California's Chief Trial Counsel announced today the filing of a notice of disciplinary charges against attorney John Charles Eastman. There are 11 charges which all stem from his conduct, his course of conduct and plan to promote and assist then President Trump in executing a strategy unsupported by facts or law to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by obstructing the count of electoral votes of certain states. And then it goes into what some of these specific charges allege. For example, that Eastman made false and misleading statements regarding purported election fraud, including statements on January 6, 2021, at a rally in Washington, D.C. that contributed to provoking a crowd to assault and breach the Capitol to intimidate then Vice President Pence and prevent the electoral count from proceeding. The Office of Chief Trial Counsel intends to seek John Eastman's disbarment before the State Bar Court. The press release filed by the State Bar, issued by the State Bar of California, also talks about how in March of 2022, someone by the name of George Cardona, the chief trial counsel, invoked a public protection waiver to make this information available. And Cardona said, quote, "There is nothing more sacrosanct to our American democracy than free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power. For California attorneys, adherence to the U.S. and California constitutions is their highest legal duty. The notice of disciplinary charges alleges that Mr. Eastman violated his duty in furtherance of an attempt to usurp the will of the American people and overturn election results." The release by the California State Bar additionally goes on to say, as has been widely reported, Eastman drafted 2 legal memos that laid out a proposed strategy to block then President-elect Joe Biden from taking office by circumventing established procedures for the counting of electoral votes in front of the U.S. Congress overseen by Vice President Pence. And then it goes on to say that the filing by the State Bar alleges that the strategies proposed by these memos, as well as remarks Eastman made publicly and privately to President Trump, Vice President Pence, and others, were unsupported by law, based on false and misleading assertions of fact, and designed for the purpose of keeping Trump in office. And so false, fraudulent, and phony claims breaching the ethical obligations that John Eastman has as a lawyer who is licensed by the State Bar of California. I mean, you think about it, this is a big fall from grace from John Eastman. John Eastman was admitted to the State Bar of California back in 1997. He used to be a very well-known and fairly renowned professor at Chapman University Law School right here in Southern California. And then, as we've always said, everything Trump touches dies, or another way of saying it when it comes to attorneys is MAGA, make attorneys, get attorneys. Eastman was intimately involved in the coup, and the efforts by the California State Bar will undoubtedly be supported by findings that were already made by a federal judge in California, Judge David Carter, based out of the Central District of California. His court is in the Southern Division in the Orange County area. And Judge David Carter has already made 2 separate findings, in connection with a lawsuit that John Eastman filed in federal court in the Central District, which got assigned to federal Judge David Carter, where John Eastman tried to block the January 6th committee from getting access to his emails and his text messages. And why was this in California, you may ask? Well, John Eastman, didn't the insurrection occur in Washington, D.C.? Eastman, as I mentioned, was a law professor at the University of Chapman Law School in Southern California. So his emails were based in California, and that's the emails that he was using in connection with his coup plot. So he filed an injunction to try to block the January 6th committee from getting his emails and his text messages, saying these were attorney-client privilege and that Donald Trump was his client. If indeed attorney-client privilege applied and there were no exceptions, then the January 6th committee would not be able to get the John Eastman records. However, one of the exceptions to attorney-client privilege is what's called the crime fraud exception. If the attorney and the client were engaged in criminal conduct and the messages or documents at issue, which are being claimed as confidential under the attorney-client privilege, those documents were in furtherance of the criminal conduct. You see, it's a two-step process, but if both of those findings are made, there is no attorney-client privilege, and those documents would get turned over in the discovery process. So the January 6th committee argued there was a crime fraud exception to attorney-client privilege. This was in furtherance of a crime. And federal judge David Carter agreed and made a finding that John Eastman and Donald Trump were engaged in a coup in search of a legal theory, that Eastman was not providing legitimate legal advice to Donald Trump, and the specific crimes they were engaged in. And again, this was a federal judge that made this finding, was an obstruction of an official proceeding, the January 6th electoral count, and a conspiracy to try to overthrow our democracy, a conspiracy to try to stop the counting of the electoral votes and overthrow a free and fair election, the peaceful transfer of power on January 6th and leading up to January 6th. And the types of documents that were turned over to the January 6th committee, we see where John Eastman, for example, is acknowledging that he is not going to be able to prevail in front of the United States Supreme Court on any of his legal claims, that he knows that his legal claims are baseless, that Eastman and Trump were just trying to stall and delay so that they could try to throw the election to state legislators so that the legislatures could ultimately try to topple the free and fair election by counting fraudulent or phony electors. Some of the other emails and messages that we see is Eastman being aware that Donald Trump and by proxy, Eastman, who's helping prepare these declarations for Donald Trump, were submitting false declarations, perjurous declarations to federal courts, including a federal court in Georgia, basically saying that here is evidence of election fraud when it was just complete phony BS conspiracy that Donald Trump's own lawyers, that Donald Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr, that the United States attorneys Donald Trump appointed, that the top Department of Justice officials after Bill Barr left, that Donald Trump's top lawyers were all saying this is false, that you are lying, that you are spreading conspiracy theories. And even we've saw in the January 6th committee, you had individuals like Eric Hirschman, for example, who worked as a counsel in the White House, said that he spoke to John Eastman, was like, congratulations, you just committed a felony, you better lawyer up. And indeed, Eastman better lawyer up. Now, Eastman will likely be disbarred by the California State Bar. This process is going to play out. And then Eastman's also being criminally investigated by special counsel Jack Smith and likely other investigative bodies as well for his criminal conduct. Is Fani Willis, for example, going to criminally indict John Eastman? Is the Manhattan District Attorney in any way looking at John Eastman? Is certainly special counsel Jack Smith is looking at John Eastman. And in addition to the California State Bar engaged in this proceedings as it relates to Eastman, we should not forget as well that Rudy Giuliani, his license has been suspended in New York. His license has been suspended in Washington, D.C. And those are just the higher profile ones. But Trump's lawyers, Trump not only lost the 70 federal cases that he filed in embarrassing and humiliating fashion, but the lawsuits were so frivolous that Donald Trump's lawyers, again, like Eastman, are being disbarred, that the lawyers have faced sanctions and other serious consequences, suspensions. They've lost their professions and livelihoods because they've engaged in this egregious criminal conduct. And for that, I say good. Good. You try to overthrow our democracy with false and phony and fraudulent information. This is the natural consequence of this. Now, what I look for as well is Alina Habba going to go next? Because we've seen the federal judge in Florida, Judge Donald Middlebrooks, already say that the sanctions alone, by the way, she and Donald Trump have now been sanctioned over $1 million based on frivolous lawsuits that they filed in Florida. That sanctions alone, even if it's millions of dollars against Donald Trump and Alina Habba, may not be enough. Aren't enough when they are engaged in such a fraudulent and despicable abuse of the judicial process, but we will follow that as well. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch podcast and the MeidasTouch network. Hit the subscribe button. We are on our way to 1 million subscribers thanks to your incredible support. Hit subscribe now. In addition to subscribing, please check us out at patreon.com/MeidasTouch, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. You will love the exclusive content we only have on our Patreon, but most importantly, it helps grow this independent media platform. Thank you so much, and until next time, I'm Ben Meiselas.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy, and look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs, It Wasn't Rigged, You're Just a Loser, at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.